Anan stepped off the long-tail boat which had traveled along the canal to dock at the decaying wooden pier before him, his heart pounding strangely. He was a young man of medium build, around 28 years old, with tan skin and sharp features, his eyes showing a look of determination. He wore a light-colored, long-sleeved shirt and dark, practical canvas pants suitable for travel, carrying an old, well-worn backpack. Dusk was now enveloping the water and sky in a grayish hue. The orange-red light of the setting sun silhouetted the large, ancient teak house that stood imposingly nearby. The musty smell of decaying old wood mixed with the stagnant scent of the canal water wafted to his nose, making him uneasy. The gentle lapping of the water sounded as if something was moving beneath its dark surface, a sound that was eerie and utterly strange. Anan felt a deep chill seep into his body, even though the air was not cold at all. The surrounding silence was broken only by the night insects beginning their ominous chorus. A certain feeling told him that this visit would not be as simple as he had first thought. The large, two-story teak house stood on wooden stilts that had been sunk deep into the canal-side mud for 100 years. The once polished wooden walls were now covered in moss stains and the ravages of time. Many window openings were agape, like mouths frozen mid-scream. The shadows of the large surrounding trees fell upon the house like giant hands ready to crush it into darkness. The atmosphere around the house was thick with gloom and oppressive darkness. Overgrown bushes choked the path, making the way into the house almost invisible. The smell of damp earth and rotting vegetation hung in the air, creating a suffocating feeling with every step he intended to take. Anan took a small flashlight from his backpack and turned it on. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a large spider web stretched across the entrance. The large wooden door looked heavy, as if it hadn't been opened in decades. The sound of the wind whistling through the cracks of the house sent shivers down his spine. He was about to step into a place that seemed completely abandoned and forgotten by the outside world. Now, a feeling of fear began to slowly creep into and grip the young man's heart. With determination and driven by the desire to solve the mystery, Anan decided to slowly push open the old, decaying wooden door. The door let out an eerie creak, like the groan of something being awakened. Stepping into the house was like stepping through time into a frozen past. The air inside was many times colder than outside. Anan felt a bitter, cold draft brush past his face, even though no windows were open in the hall. The flashlight beam hit dust motes floating in the air like hundreds and thousands of spirit particles. The sight of antique furniture covered with old white cloths arranged in the corners of the room created a depressing feeling. The silence within the house was more terrifying than any sound, as if all sounds from the outside world had been swallowed whole. In that silence, Anan could hear his own heart pounding. A faint whisper, seeming to drift from somewhere, slowly instilled terror in him. He could feel eyes watching him from the shadows, a gaze that was not human, but one filled with resentment and rage, waiting for the day of its release. In the dead of the silent night, Anan couldn't force himself to sleep. The feeling of being watched still lingered around him. The young man rose from the hard wooden floor he used as a temporary resting place, picking up his flashlight once more to explore this house of mystery in detail. The beam swept across wooden walls filled with ancient carvings, but some parts were scarred with scratch marks, as if from fingernails dragged frantically. He could feel an energy emanating from every corner of the house. Every step he took sent a creak through the old floorboards, as if the house itself was crying out a warning about something hidden within. Intermittent cold drafts made the hair on his arms stand on end uncontrollably. Anan was certain that he was not alone in this abandoned house, no matter how much he tried to tell himself it was just his imagination. Fear began to slowly creep into his mind, but his determination to find the truth remained stronger. He had to know what happened here, and why this house was left abandoned with such a terrible secret. Anan explored the rooms, which seemed to have been abandoned for decades. The bedroom, the living room, the kitchen, all were covered in thick dust and spider webs that looked like shrouds. The scattered antique belongings hinted at a life that once existed here, but now only emptiness and a terrifying silence remained. The young man tried to open the drawer of an old, grimy wooden cabinet, but found only blank old papers and some torn scraps of cloth. He slowly opened a window, hoping the outside breeze would blow away some of the gloom within, but only the darkness of the night enveloped him instead. Anan froze when he heard a sound like something moving, coming from the storage room behind. The sound was faint, like something scraping against the old wooden floor. It made his heart pound uncontrollably. He swallowed hard, gathering his courage to walk towards the sound and confront whatever was waiting there. The storage room was much darker and stuffier than the other rooms. The rank smell of age and the musty scent of mold hung in the air, making him dizzy. Anan shone his flashlight into the endless darkness. The light hit objects piled high over his head. Old wooden chests, tables, broken chairs, all covered in old white cloths, like shrouded corpses. Anan felt a rapidly intensifying chill as he stepped into the room. A suffocating pressure crashed down on him as if something were enveloping him from all directions. Suddenly, he glimpsed a dark silhouette moving quickly in the corner of the room. A faint whisper seeped into his senses, like the sound of wind whistling through teeth. It was a voice filled with pain and malice. Anan froze in shock, his legs completely immobile. He felt pinned to the spot by an unseen energy. The young man struggled to gather his wits and his nearly stopped breath to truly comprehend what was before him before the darkness swallowed him whole. In the early morning of the next day, Anan woke up feeling utterly exhausted from the previous night's supernatural encounter, but his determination to find answers had not faded. The medium-built young man with tan skin, sharp features, and around 28 years of age walked down to the canal-side pier to wash his face and take in the fresh morning air. A thick fog covered the water's surface and the surrounding area, obscuring the view. The smell of damp earth and aquatic plants hung in the air. The gentle sound of water lapping against the bank created an atmosphere that was both eerie and peaceful. He noticed a small rowboat slowly emerging through the curtain of fog, and the figure of an old woman rowing it, slowly bringing it to dock at the pier. The old woman's eyes looked at Anan with a gaze full of kindness, yet tinged with a certain sadness. She was Yai Pring, an old woman with all white hair, a face wrinkled with age, and age-spotted skin, about 70-something years old. She wore a sarong, fatung, a sleeveless blouse, sua kor krachao, and carried a woven wicker basket. She was an old-timer who had lived in this area since birth. Yai Pring had been told by the villagers that a young man had returned to this old house, and it seemed she knew the stories hidden within it very well. Anan decided to walk over to Yai Pring, greeting her politely while explaining his intention to return to this ancestral home. The old woman nodded slowly, her eyes looking towards the old wooden house with a gaze full of concern and wistful sorrow. Yai Pring began to tell Anan the story of the past in a low but resonant voice, speaking of the legend of this house, which was not just an ordinary wooden house, but one filled with sad stories and the mystery of the sudden departures of people in his family for generations. The old woman mentioned the name Pikul, a beautiful young woman who had lived in this house long ago. Pikul was a sweet girl, loved by all, but she faced a tragic fate, being harmed and left to sink into the canal in front of the house without receiving any justice. Anan listened intently to every word Yai Pring said, It was a story no one had ever told him before. The pain and vengeful resentment of Pikul still lingered in the waters of this canal. Yai Pring continued, saying that Pikul's spirit was never freed from her suffering and rage. She believed Pikul's spirit still lingered within the house and around the canal, awaiting the vengeance and justice she never received. The return of Anan, a descendant of the house's former owners, might be a sign that this spirit wishes to communicate and wants her painful story to be revealed, a truth buried deep in the family's history. Anan began to understand the feeling of being watched from the night before. It might have been Pikul's whiskers trying to tell him her story. The young man felt a heavy weight of responsibility, but also a strong determination to solve the mystery of her death and free the trapped spirit. Yai Pring looked at Anan with eyes full of hope. She warned him to be careful, as a spirit filled with such malice could be unpredictable. Anan thanked Yai Pring and promised to do his best to resolve the entire story. After hearing the story from Yai Pring, Anan returned to the old wooden house with a completely changed mindset. His initial fear was replaced by a determination to find the truth. The medium-built young man, about 28 years old, was dressed in practical clothes for exploration. He began to explore the house again in detail, especially the area where he had felt a strange energy the night before. Anan went upstairs to a part of the house he hadn't thoroughly explored during the night. The largest bedroom at the innermost corner of the house seemed to have been sealed for much longer than the others. A musty smell and the scent of dried flowers wafted from the cracks in the door. Anan tried to open the door, but found it locked tight. He used all his strength to slowly push the old wooden door open. A loud creaking sound echoed throughout the house. Anan stepped into the room cautiously. The late afternoon sunlight filtering through the wooden gaps illuminated the dust motes swirling in the air like hundreds and thousands of tiny spirits. The sight of a large teak bed in the center of the room, still covered with a white cloth, looked like a coffin awaiting someone's departure. Anan explored around the room and noticed a secret drawer hidden under the base of the bed. It was hidden so skillfully that it was almost invisible if one didn't look closely. The young man used all his strength to pry the drawer open with difficulty, and what he found inside made his heart pound violently. It was an old diary wrapped in dark silk cloth and several faded photographs. Anan picked up the diary and slowly opened it. The scrawled handwriting indicated its age, spanning nearly a century. This diary belonged to Pikul, the young woman Yai Pring had mentioned. The first few pages described the happiness of her daily life, but as he turned to the next pages, the content became filled with sorrow, fear, and excruciating pain. She described being betrayed and imprisoned within this house, as well as the wicked plot laid out to eliminate her. Anan read the entire story meticulously, line by line. He felt as if he had traveled back in time to that painful past himself. The faded photographs found in the drawer revealed the beautiful face of Pikul. In the first few photos, her eyes were full of innocence and happiness, but in the last one, those same eyes were filled with an indelible fear and pain. Anan could feel the pain radiating from the photograph, as if Pikul's spirit was still imprisoned in that picture of a terrible memory. The diary and the photographs were crucial evidence confirming the story Yai Pring had told him. Anan slowly began to piece the entire story together. A cruel truth, hidden for 100 years, was now about to be revealed. He felt a great sense of responsibility to free Pikul's spirit from the suffering she had endured. This journey was not just about solving a mystery, but about bringing justice back to a cruelly treated soul. A sense of pressure and determination mixed within the young man's mind. Night fell once again. Moonlight streamed into the house through a broken window, creating dark, flickering shadows on the walls. Anan was still in the upstairs bedroom where he'd found it, reading Pikul's diary over and over. The medium-built young man, about 28 years old, whose face still showed signs of deep thought, suddenly felt a chilling breeze sweep through the room, even though the window was closed. A faint whisper, like his name being called, sounded near his ear, making his hair stand on end. Anan looked up from the diary. His eyes slowly scanned the room, trying to find the source of the strange sound. The silence that replaced the whisper was more terrifying than any noise, as if everything around him had been swallowed by the darkness. He picked up his flashlight and shone it into the corners of the room before the beam came to rest on a large antique mirror standing in a corner. It was a mirror adorned with an intricately carved wooden frame, but now it was covered in dust and scratches, as if it had been abandoned for a century. Anan felt a powerful energy emanating fiercely from that mirror. Anan slowly walked towards the mirror, his heart beating erratically, as if warning of impending danger. The young man carefully used his hand to wipe the dust off the mirror's surface. As soon as the dust was cleared, his reflection appeared, but in a flash it began to distort horrifyingly. Anan's face in the mirror turned deathly pale, his eyes became pitch black, and trails of bloody tears streamed down his cheeks as if he were crying in agony. Then his reflection was replaced by the face of a young woman. Her face was filled with suffering and rage. Her once beautiful eyes were now filled with emptiness and a terrifying glint of malice. Anan knew instantly that it was the face of Pikul, the spirit trapped in this house. She had revealed herself to him in this very mirror of vengeance. A faint scream emanated from within the mirror, like the sound of pain she couldn't release for 100 years. Anan recoiled quickly in utter shock. A terrifying energy radiated from the mirror, so intense that he could feel the pain spreading through his body. Anan's breath hitched in fear. He had never had such a terrifying experience in his life. The image of Fikun's face in the mirror was seared into his mind, as if she were urgently trying to tell him something. The young man gathered his scattered wits. He realized this was no longer just a legend, but a reality unfolding before his eyes. He picked up Fikun's diary again and began to reread the entire content meticulously, with a deeper understanding than before. He tried to find clues that would help him understand what Pikul wanted to communicate through that horrifying vision. Anan walked to the window, looking out into the darkness of the night that enveloped the house. The whisper from the water he had heard on his first day now sounded frightening and filled with indescribable pain. He felt an even greater sense of responsibility to help free this trapped spirit from its long abyss of suffering. Anan vowed to himself that he would never give up until he had discovered the whole truth and brought peace back to this house of the water spirit. The next morning, Anan woke up determined to find answers from Fikun's diary and the vision he had seen in the mirror the night before. The medium-built young man, about 28 years old, who was sleep-deprived from fear but filled with determination, tried to meticulously interpret the messages and symbols Fikun had left in the diary. Some words were crossed out, and some sentences held deep, hidden meanings. Anan spent the entire morning analyzing all the information he had. He noticed that some pages had been deliberately torn out, as if something important was being concealed, not meant for anyone to know. Anan sensed something amiss, making him question the sincerity of certain individuals involved in this story. The truth about to be revealed might be far more complex than he had anticipated. The young man began to connect the various stories, trying to piece together the scattered puzzle fragments into a complete picture. From carefully reading the diary, Anan discovered that Fikun had a great passion for flowers, especially the Fikun flower, which shared her name. She described the flower garden that used to be behind the house, a place where she spent most of her time. Fikun often picked flowers to decorate the house and would always wear one tucked behind her ear. Anan believed that the flower garden might be the key to solving the remaining mystery. The young man walked down to the back of the house. The sight before him was a once thriving garden, now an overgrown wasteland filled with bushes and weeds that almost completely obscured its original form. The air in this area was slightly more chilling than elsewhere, despite it being midday with bright sunlight. The smell of damp earth and decaying plants hung in the air, creating a desolate feeling for him. Anan began to explore the garden slowly, trying to find any remains of the fikun flowers that might still be left, or any traces fikun might have left behind. He felt as if he were being guided by some unseen energy. It was a feeling that told him to press on, no matter what horrors he might encounter. Anan continued to explore until he accidentally tripped over a stone buried underground. The young man looked down and found that the stone was part of a stone-paved path, now covered with moss and weeds. Anan began to dig in the area with his bare hands, and what he found made his heart pound violently. It was a small wooden box, decayed by time, but still bearing the faint carving of a fikun flower on top. Anan carefully opened the box. Inside was only an old envelope containing another letter in fikun's handwriting and a pendant shaped like a fikun flower made of a tarnished metal. This letter was something Fikun had written before she died. It revealed the horrifying truth about who was behind her death. The man closest to her, whom she trusted most, was the one who betrayed her with a wicked plan, hoping for her wealth and fame. Anan read the letter with shock and rage. He had just learned how mercilessly his ancestor had been wronged. The secret, buried for 100 years, was now fully revealed. The letter from Pikul made Anan realize the evil hidden in his family's history. The medium-built young man, about 28 years old, his face still pale with shock, reread the letter over and over to understand every detail. The revealed truth was far more shocking and cruel than he had ever imagined. Anan felt a surge of anger on Fikun's behalf. He decided he must bring justice to this cruelly wronged spirit. The young man set out for a nearby village to investigate further about the person mentioned in the letter. He thought of Kamnan Serm, a middle-aged, burly man with a sullen face, dark skin, and cunning eyes, around 50-plus years old, dressed in respectable but dirty clothes, who was the influential local headman and seemed to know his family's history well. Anan had distrusted Kamnan Serm from first sight, but he needed to meet the headman to get more information and clarify the whole story. When Anan arrived at Kamnan Serm's house, a large house not far from his own, Kamnan Serm welcomed Anan with a feigned, untrustworthy smile. Anan began to ask about the history of the house and his family. Kamnan Serm tried to be evasive and avoid answering directly. His eyes flickered rapidly when Anan mentioned Fikun's name and her death. Kamnan Serm said those stories were just old legends that shouldn't be heeded, But Anan could sense something was wrong with the headman's demeanor, a secret he was trying to hide. Anan decided to pretend to believe the headman's words and excused himself to return home. But in his heart, he was filled with growing suspicion and unease. He began to suspect that Kamnan Serm might be more deeply involved in the past events than he had thought. The darkness of dusk began to creep over the village. The smell of mud and the fishy scent from the canal drifted to his nose, making him feel uneasy. Anan walked back to the house cautiously, a heavy sense of insecurity beginning to gnaw at his mind. As the moonless night fell, Anan returned to the house and felt a chill quickly spreading through the air. The water in the canal in front of the house began to flow with an unnatural turbulence, as if something were stirring it from beneath the dark surface. The medium-built young man, about 28 years old, whose face still showed exhaustion but whose eyes were filled with determination, walked to the pier. What he saw there nearly made his heart stop. A shadowy figure of a young woman appeared in the middle of the canal. Her hair was soaking wet and long, her face was deathly pale, and her eyes were filled with terrifying pain and vengeance. It was Pikul. Her spirit appeared clearly before Anan. She stared at him with eyes full of rage, reaching a hand as pale as a corpse out of the freezing water, as if inviting him to join her in its soul-swallowing depths. An intense pressure and coldness crashed down on Anan. The screams that came from beneath the canal were not ordinary screams of pain, but screams filled with a resentment waiting to be unleashed. Fikun's appearance this time was more intense and clearer than ever before. Anan realized he had to find a way to free her as soon as possible before she sank into the abyss of darkness forever. After a direct confrontation with Fikun's spirit, Anan rushed to see Yai Pring the next morning, filled with fear and confusion. The medium-built young man, about 28 years old, his face still pale from a sleepless night, told the old woman the entire story in detail. Yai Pring listened to Anan's story with a calm expression, but her eyes showed deep understanding. The old woman, with her all-white hair, wrinkled face, wearing a patang and a kar krachao blouse, said that Fikun's clear appearance was a sign that she urgently needed to be set free. Yai Pring told Anan there was only one way to help Fikun, to find an important object connected to her spirit and use it in a liberation ritual at the place where her life ended. Yai Pring said that the object was a carved wooden doll of a young girl that Fikun had cherished most, and it was hidden in a secret place no one knew of. Anan felt the heavy weight of responsibility, but he was filled with determination to do everything he could to help Fikun. Yai Pring led Anan to a small old shrine by the canal, which looked desolate and was covered in trees and vines. This shrine was a sacred place where villagers in the past used to perform various rituals. The old woman lit incense and offering flowers, murmuring a soft chant to apologize and ask permission from the sacred entities for a smooth process in helping Fikun's spirit. Anan noticed that the shrine had an old statue of a female tree spirit, Nang Mai, that looked frightening and was partially cracked. Yai Pring suggested that Anan try searching through old records or tales from the older generation that might have recorded where the wooden doll was hidden. Anan decided to return to the old wooden house to search for more clues. He felt that time was running out. The air around the shrine was chilling, and the smell of old incense and flowers hung in the air. The wind whistled through the gaps of the shrine, like the whispers of a spirit waiting for liberation. Anan felt an unseen energy, its existence clearly palpable. Anan returned to the house and began to search every nook and cranny for the mentioned wooden doll. The medium-built young man, about 28 years old, his face still showing a strained expression, remembered what Yai Pring had said about Fikun's love for the Fikun flower and how she liked to tuck it behind her ear. He walked to the upstairs bedroom where he had found the diary, and his eyes stopped on a crack in the wooden wall near the window. Anan carefully pried open the rotting wood with his hands, and what he found made his heart pound again. Inside the hidden compartment lay a small, carved wooden doll of a young girl. It was stained and moldy, but the traces of its former beauty were still clearly visible. The doll had a dried Fikun flower gently tucked behind its ear. Anan picked up the doll with trembling hands. He believed this was the important object Fikun's spirit had been waiting for 100 years. He had to quickly take it to perform the liberation ritual before her spirit plunged into an abyss of vengeance from which it could never return. In the dead of night, Anan brought the carved wooden doll he had found out to the pier in front of the old wooden house. The sky was now moonless, with only darkness enveloping everything. The young man, of medium build, about 28 years old, whose face was still pale from insufficient rest, but whose eyes were filled with determination, lit several candles and arranged them in a circle on the decaying wooden floor, placing offering flowers and the wooden doll in the center. The water in the canal in front of the house began to ripple with abnormal violence, as if something was moving beneath the dark water. The wind whistled through the large trees standing by the canal, creating a hair-raising humming sound. The fishy smell of water and a damp, musty scent hung in the air. Anan began to chant the prayer as Yai Pring had taught him. His voice was soft, yet it echoed in the silence of the night. Every word he uttered was filled with the intention to set the imprisoned spirit free. The tension and fear grew steadily, and the young man felt an unseen energy building up around him. As Anan continued to chant, the candles he had lit began to flicker and, surprisingly, went out one by one. Darkness once again consumed the pier area. Faint whispers, a mixture of crying and screaming, arose from the water's surface, which had now turned pitch black, like a bottomless abyss. Anan tried to compose himself and chant louder than before. He gritted his teeth, his eyes fixed on the water in front of him. Suddenly, the figure of a young woman slowly rose from beneath the water. She stood in the middle of the canal, her bloodshot eyes filled with rage and pain. It was Pikul, in the most terrifying form he had ever seen. Her long, flowing hair was soaking wet and floated on the current. An intense aura of vengeance emanated from her body. Pikul stared at Anan with eyes full of resentment, as if to say she would never forgive those who had made her suffer. The surrounding air became so chillingly cold that Anan felt pain throughout his body. Pikul's spirit was about to attack him. Anan tried to remain calm and chanted relentlessly. He had to complete this mission, no matter the cost. Anan stood his ground and continued to chant relentlessly, even as overwhelming fear gripped his mind. The young man of medium build, about 28 years old, his face covered in a cold sweat, raised the wooden doll above his head as he chanted a prayer dedicating merit to Pikul. His voice began to tremble, but he refused to stop. Pikul let out a wailing scream and lunged at Anan with great speed. Her claws shot out, intending to harm him, but the power of the chant and Anan's determined mind made Pikul falter slightly. Her bloodshot eyes stared at the wooden doll in Anan's hand with a look full of confusion, before the rage in her eyes slowly turned to sorrow. Her scream faded and became a pitiful sob. Anan continued to chant, trying to let Pikul know he was there to set her free. He wanted her to receive justice and finally go to a peaceful afterlife. Pikul's spirit began to weaken. She slowly collapsed into the canal, her body starting to glow with a soft light before she gradually sank and disappeared into the now calm water. At dawn, the morning sunlight shone into the old wooden house through the broken window frames. Anan woke up with a feeling of relief and clarity he had never felt before. The young man of medium build, about 28 years old, whose face still looked weary, but whose eyes were filled with happiness, found that the fear and gloom that once shrouded the house had completely vanished, leaving only tranquility and fresh air. Anan walked around the house again and noticed several changes. The wooden walls, once covered in grime, looked surprisingly clean. The cobwebs that had covered every nook and cranny were all gone, as if someone had cleaned the entire house overnight. The musty smell and the scent of oldness had faded, replaced by the faint, fresh fragrance of earth and vegetation. Anan knew instantly that Fikun's spirit had truly been liberated. She had finally gone to a peaceful afterlife. The young man felt a deep sense of joy that he had been able to complete this mission. Anan walked down to the pier by the canal. The scene before him was calm and clear water, with the morning sunlight sparkling on its surface. There was no sound of violently rippling water, no thick fog, no fishy smell, only the sound of various birds singing their beautiful morning songs. Anan looked in the direction where Fikun's spirit had disappeared the night before. His eyes were filled with a sense of farewell and longing, but also with an understanding of her fate. He brought flowers he had picked from the garden behind the house and floated them in the canal as a final farewell to Fikun, as if to say she no longer had to suffer. Justice had finally come to her. Anan felt that his mission was finally accomplished. He had successfully freed the vengeful spirit that had been trapped for 100 years. The heavy burden he had carried in his heart from the beginning was now completely lifted. He walked back to the house with a smile on his face, a smile that came with a sense of victory. Anan decided to stay at the wooden house for a while longer to clean and restore it, bringing it back to life. The young man of medium build, about 28 years old, whose body and mind had grown stronger from the experience, intended to keep Fikun's journal as a lesson and to prevent anyone else from facing such a tragic fate. Yai Pring visited Anan late in the morning. The old woman with all white hair and a wrinkled face had eyes full of happiness and relief. She looked at Anan with admiration and thanked him for freeing Fikun's spirit from its long suffering. Yai Pring and Anan sat and talked about all that had happened, feeling relaxed and without fear. This Ruin Prainam, house of the water spirit, was no longer a house of vengeance, but a house of memory and a lesson on how important justice is, and that, even though death may take the body, truth and a spirit of vengeance will always await.